Colin Smith was in the Supreme Court chambers this morning. Colin, we heard former Solicitor General Paul Clement speaking this morning, and I was just talking about how difficult it is to kind of read into Supreme Court justices' minds merely by the questions they ask. But give me a sense of what you took away from being inside there this morning.
Well, I certainly think that you saw the court divided along ideological lines, and there were certain segments, you're absolutely right, Bruce, it's very difficult to figure out what is going on inside that beautiful legal mind of theirs. But Justice Scalia, who is arguably the most conservative of the 9 justices on the court, and certainly the most conservative of the 8 that sat today after Justice Elena Kagan recused herself, Justice Scalia said about halfway through the oral arguments, what does sovereignty mean if you don't have the power to defend your own state's borders?
Interesting.
And I certainly think that resonates with what Arizona lawmakers and proponents of SB 1070 have been saying for quite a while. Again, this is a case that has to do with where does federal law stop and where does state latitude begin in terms of where can they begin enforcing immigration policies, some of which are the federal government's own immigration policies. I think sometimes this entire discussion has been shrouded about the constitutionality of all of SB 1070. It's not about that at all. It's about 4 specific provisions and the legality of that and whether federal law trumps, or to use a more legal term, preempts states' ability to enforce those laws within their own borders.
KTAR's Colin Smith is joining us live from the steps of the Supreme Court here on the Bruce St. James Show. Colin, I think I'm curious as to any indication Anthony Kennedy, he's always the swing vote. You know, we know the conservatives on the court. There are 4 of them. There are 4 liberals. There are 3 liberals in this particular case. Is it going to come down to that Anthony Kennedy swing vote again?
I think it certainly could, especially if you bring up the idea of 8 justices. You could have 4 vote in favor of Arizona. You could have 4 vote against Arizona. Interestingly, Anthony Kennedy was very, very quiet throughout the discussion today. He asked 3 questions, I believe, and as he typically does, he asked them very ideologically and very hypothetically. Late in the oral arguments, about 15 minutes before the case was submitted, he asked a hypothetical question. If there was a situation where there were significant problems in Arizona such that the state was being so flooded with illegal immigrants that there were people leaving Arizona, citizens leaving Arizona, can a state go to its lawmakers and say, fix this? Again, along those same lines of how far can states go on enforcing immigration policy. But that was as clear as he really made what he was thinking. So, yeah, I mean, if you want a clue as to how the court is going to vote, it's often Anthony Kennedy. We saw that in the health care discussion right here at the High Court last month. But very difficult to tell which way he was leaning and which way he will ultimately vote in this historic case.
Well, Colin, one of the aspects that they're looking at specifically is checking the status, the immigration status of people that they think are in the country illegally, especially, you know, obviously here in Arizona. Now, when it came to that line of questioning, it's starting to suggest that the justices are not buying the Obama administration's argument that the state is exceeding its authority when it makes that records check part. Is that what you got from sitting in the courtroom?
Yeah, Pamela, that's an excellent question, and you're absolutely right. And Justice Sam Alito was the one that asked the most pointed questions on that. He asked, it seems to me that the federal government doesn't want to know who's here illegally and who's not. In other words, how is it preempting federal policy to pick up a phone as a police officer and call ICE and ask whether this person they just pulled over is here in the country illegally or not? In other words, Chief Justice John Roberts had the same line of questioning. It seems like the federal government doesn't want to know whether people are here illegally or not, but they had kind of gone down that road that doesn't mean that Arizona is preempting or trampling on federal policy. It just means that they want to ascertain the status, which, by the way, the federal government is required to do. If a police officer calls the federal government, ICE, and says, what is the immigration status of this individual, the feds are required to give that information out. And so you're absolutely right, Pamela. It did not seem like the justices were buying that is preempted by federal law. In other words, Arizona has complete right to ask what the immigration status of certain individuals are if they're pulled over for routine traffic stops or whatever.
Colin Smith, KTAR's Colin Smith, live on the steps of the Supreme Court of the United States. Colin, it sounds like a kazoo band behind you. I was hoping that maybe you could paint a bit of a picture for me, and we've heard about this. And you know, one of the stories has been that people aren't as into that. They aren't as engaged. This isn't as hot a topic as it was, say, 2 years ago, but it certainly sounds like you have people behind you. Can you tell me and paint a picture for what's going on there at the Supreme Court outside?
Yeah, there is a large group of protesters. They are just beyond the steps here. I'm looking at them as I look in the distance. The Capitol is right behind them, but they are on the steps of the High Court here outside the Supreme Court building. Probably a group of 200, 300, maybe even 400 protesters. Okay. I see these signs, Justice for All. SB 1070 is racism. Do I look illegal to you? I mean, the typical signs that you would see at a protest, but it is certainly, there are a few signs that are pro-SB 1070, but it is almost 90-10, those that are anti-SB 1070 here, and they are loud, let me tell you. And really a big change, because when I got here, probably around 7:45, 8 o'clock this morning, there's nobody here. Yeah. I'm like, wow, this is it. You know, and to your point, wow, maybe this issue really has died down in terms of how it's galvanized certain groups. They certainly proved me wrong on that 3 hours later here.
Colin, thank you very much.
Big story of the day is the Supreme Court. Joining us now live from Washington, D.C. is KTAR's own Colin Smith. Colin, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you guys?
Good. Take us through, what was it? Did it last about 70 minutes? A lot of people said that, hey, you know what? When they were going to go argue this, they thought it would take a lot longer. Apparently, that wasn't the case. This was in and out, right?
That's right. It was the standard 1 hour, went a little bit longer. The justices did keep the legal counsels for both sides up there a little bit longer than they traditionally do. But heck, this is the last case in the Supreme Court cycle this spring, so no surprise there. But yeah, not incredibly long and painstaking, just 70 minutes to hash out the nation's most controversial immigration law.
Obviously, Colin, we'll have to wait until the end of June in order to hear what the decision is, but this comes less than a month after hearing a challenge to the controversial Obama health care law.
Oh, that's right.
It seems like the Fed is under attack, and I was wondering if you got a sense from these justices whether or not they were siding one way or the other, because from what we understand, a couple of the justices went on, I shouldn't say the offensive, it's not like they were attacking, but they were asking more questions on the federal side of, like, can you prove this case? What's going on here? Rather than really hitting back hard against the state of Arizona.
Yeah, no question about it. Don Verrilli, who was the Solicitor General who argued on behalf of the Obama administration, got the brunt of the questions by both liberal and conservative justices. Not a big surprise what Antonin Scalia said. About halfway through, he said, look, this is a federal law that the state is simply enforcing on the state level. Why can a state not do that? And he mentioned, the quotation was pretty telling, what good is sovereignty if a state can't protect its own borders? Now, that's not incredibly surprising because he, of course, is the staunch conservative on the court, and, you know, he has been for 25 years, and so you know, for the most part, what kind of take you're going to get from him. But even a justice that was more liberal-leaning, Sonia Sotomayor, indicated that this is a situation where the Obama administration, your argument isn't selling. You're trying to tell me that the state, by enforcing a federal policy in Arizona, ultimately turning these suspected illegal immigrants over to the federal government, that is preempted by federal law. And she said, flat out, your argument's not selling well.
And when you talk about Sonia Sotomayor, a Latina,
right,
who is on the Supreme Court, who is
recently appointed
a liberal, and she is saying that Obama's counsel is not cutting it, to me, wow, that speaks volumes.
Right, exactly.
And also, Colin, were there comments made comparing this to bank robbery? For instance, that's a federal crime. Don't they expect states to enforce that?
Yeah, that was, again, a Scalia argument, really fascinating. Where do we draw the line in terms of what policies states can enforce if they're federal laws already? For example, robbing a bank is a federal crime. But at the same time, there are state policies so that police agencies in Arizona and any other state can obviously pursue bank robbers. So that's a federal crime that is being handled on the state level. Why is immigration different?
Colin Smith is joining us live from Washington, D.C. He has been reporting over the last couple days for us. I think something that I'm thinking out loud, I look at SB 1070 and I'm a little bit confused. I see the original version. I see the neutered down version. Let's say that in June, when the Supreme Court does go ahead and vote, let's say that they vote in favor of Arizona.
Yeah, let's say it winds up being like 5-1
Whatever
or 5-3 in favor of Arizona.
What does the law look like? And how are they going to enforce it? Is it going to be the old version of SB 1070 with the
everything,
teeth,
right,
or is it going to be the neutered down version?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because, remember, the state is considering 4 different provisions that were originally blocked by the district court in Phoenix in an injunction. Those blockages were upheld by the Ninth Circuit Court, and then Arizona pushed to get it to the Supreme Court. So it's
2
not
courts have already said, no, you can't do this.
Which is why they went to the Supreme Court.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not the entirety of the law. It is the 4 provisions requiring law enforcement to check the immigration status of anyone who's legally stopped. So police officers pick up a phone and call ICE and say, hey, I just pulled over this guy. I suspect he's in the country illegally.
Yep.
Is he or not? The feds are required to say, yes, he is, no, she isn't, whatever it may be. And then, by the way, the feds make the decision ultimately on what to do with that individual. So Arizona's not prosecuting them. They are still leaving the jurisdiction with the federal government. They're just making that phone call under reasonable suspicion.
Because they may ignore. They may ignore it. We've seen that before.
Right. And that was exactly what Chief Justice John Roberts said was, hey, seems to me the federal government doesn't care if people are illegally here or not. That was his comment. Back to your question, Gatos.
Yes.
It's difficult to say what kind of 1070 we're going to get if the court rules for Arizona. They could rule for just one of those provisions. They could rule for all 4. How much teeth this law will have when the court rules will depend on how many provisions are upheld or ultimately struck down.
Now, Colin, there was a lot of misinformation spread about this law after it was signed. For instance, that police could pull you over based solely on the suspicion you're here illegally. And that generated a lot of anger and protests nationally, internationally. So do you think now that there's a lot of surprise over how the Supreme Court reacted to those arguments and the fact that they may actually uphold parts of this law?
It's interesting because so often we've heard the racial profiling argument. And I think it was, quite honestly, the strongest argument that the administration had. Look, if you're talking about reasonable suspicion that someone is in the country illegally, does that not sound like opening a Pandora's box on racial profiling? And yet from the outset, the Solicitor General said, we're not going there. We're just going to go the preemption route and say Arizona overstepped its bounds. This is the federal government's jurisdiction. They've got no business getting involved. So racial profiling was never brought up this morning. So, Jamie, that was the entire issue here. It was the legality of how much power states have. Racial profiling was never considered this morning. The Solicitor General never considered it part of the case, and that was made clear from the very outset. And as a result of that, I think you're going to see more misinformation going forward.
All right, Colin Smith live in Washington, D.C. Colin, we will check back in with you later in the show. Thanks so much.